Hello, and welcome to this podcast series, Rooted, a Lenten series hosted by Krista Corbello
and Justin Perry.
In today's episode, we are discussing what it means to be human and encounter the real. Justin, it's so good to have you on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
I'm excited to talk about this series because we have been talking about this for close to 10 years, honestly.
Very true. Very true.
I remember the first time we talked about collaborating on something together. We've had a lot of iterations of a project. I know we talked about like different communications things. We talked about a podcast at one time. I'm glad that we landed on this, and I just wanted to introduce you to the listener. So Justin is one of my friends from college. I definitely remember the day that I met you. You had a table full of women and you were talking about theology of the body very passionately. And I was like, man, this guy should get married. He wants to get married and he understands marriage. I'm like 18 years old. I don't understand marriage, but this guy understands marriage. So anyway, I just remember being really amazed at how eloquent you were about certain things. And another personal favorite Justin Perry story of mine is when we were in college, you're the president of the pro-life club, and we were setting up the Cemetery of the Innocents, and I overheard a conversation that you had with someone on campus. And again, I remember thinking, he's so eloquent. I could never be that smart. I could never have a conversation like that. He knew what to say and how to say it, and that person was receptive to it. And I was literally just putting flags in the ground, and I was like, this is the very little that I feel I can do in the movement. I can make brownies for the bake sale and put flags in the ground. But I just remember being in awe of that way of discourse how you could encounter another college student intellectually and personally. So we've been friends for a long time, Justin, since my freshman year of college, for sure. And we've done a lot of different projects together, and I'm glad we're doing this Lenten series together. So would you like to introduce yourself to the listener?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you gave me such a kind introduction, but just to provide a little bit more about myself, my name is Justin Perry. I am from Louisiana. I work in software development, which is kind of an interesting place for me to end up because I'm the least likely person to end up in the tech industry. So I had been kind of one of the original Luddites. I didn't get my first iPhone until I think 2015, maybe when I was graduating college. I was always very much, technology is messing us up. It's bad. We need to get away from it and just go back to the old way of doing things, and very kind of set on that. And over the years that moderated. I ended up falling into a job in tech. It was just what was available. I took the opportunity and ended up really liking it. So my view towards tech nuanced over time, but I'm still glad I had that initial sort of Luddite introduction to it, because while I don't subscribe to that same all out rejection of technology, I think there's a lot of good in it. I think there's a lot of good that we can use it for in our daily lives. I do think it's important to have that mistrust of it in a way, holding it at arm's length and approaching it to figure out how do we incorporate this in a way that allows us to retain our humanity and not lose ourselves to the virtual world. So it's something I think about a lot in my daily work, but just in general, bringing together the thoughts on what it means to be human in this new AI digital age, whatever you want to call it.
You know what? A movie just came up in my feed, I guess. The movie Her. You remember, like, it was like, when we were in college, it came out, and he like falls in love with his phone or whatever. And I remember I didn't watch it in college because I remember being pretty disturbed by the content of it at the time. And I mean, that was so many years ago. And look at where we're at now. And I certainly remember your disdain for social media, particularly at the time. So tell us about your relationship with social media while we're at it.
Yeah, so that's kind of a interesting story too. Like most everyone else my age, I had a Facebook account since high school. And as I developed into that growing mistrust of technology, I got to a point, I'm like, this is doing us more harm than good. So I'm just going to get rid of it. And I remember I first got rid of it. This is probably like 2011, 2012 or so. Definitely a different time than it is now. And I remember I got rid of it. I made a big deal about it. I told everybody I'm quitting social media. And it was interesting. People's reaction was just complete disbelief. Like, Why are you doing that? How could you do that? What's wrong with you? Yeah. So I did it for a while, and it didn't take long for me to cave and restart my account because I felt like, oh, I'm missing out on things and I need to talk to people and connect and all of that. So I did get it back, and I had it for many years, continued after that. Fairly light user, but I did use it. But I remember it was around COVID when, of course, I think everybody experienced the social media landscape changed even more.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that it was making me genuinely unhappy. I think it had been before, but it was just genuinely causing me anxiety and stress to go onto social media, especially in such an isolated way. And I realized I'm like, hey, this is not helping me. This is not providing any benefit, and it's doing more harm than good. So I'm gonna delete my account, not deactivate it, delete it. And I did. So this was in 2021. And this time I didn't really make a big deal out of it. I just kind of told a few people and just slipped off the radar, and that was that. And it's been actually, it was about, I think it was 5 years ago today that I've been off of Facebook and social media. So, and it's interesting to compare it to that first period because, as I mentioned, I don't tend to trumpet it around necessarily, but sometimes people will bring up like, oh, I couldn't find you on Facebook. I'm like, well, I'm not on there. And the reaction that I get now is very different from that first time around, in that now the reaction is not, what's wrong with you? Are you hiding something? But it's just more like, oh, I wish I could do that. Or even I respect that. I would love to do that myself. I'm only on social media because of XYZ. I'm like, you don't have to make excuses. I don't care if you're on social media, but I'm just telling you that I'm not. But I think it's interesting because it reflects a very dramatic societal shift in the view towards it. Even just 15 years ago, there was this sense that this is connecting us all. This is just nothing but good. And there's something wrong with you almost if you're not on it. To now, it's like almost everybody sees as something has gone deeply wrong in our relationship with technology. And that's not to say, and I don't even know that I would say now everybody needs to get off of social media. That's a much more nuanced question than anything. But I think whether someone chooses to stay on social media or doesn't go off of it, most people will realize something has gone wrong with our current way of interacting in discourse today.
You know, the way you like told the story, even though I've heard the story a few times, it made me think of how people react to people saying they're vegan or something. Like where someone says they're vegan, everyone's like, well, I only eat meat because blah, 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 blah. So there's like strong reactions, I think, whenever people make these lifestyle choices, which is what you've done. You've made like a lifestyle choice based on your reflection, but also your experience. And I think that's really important to note. So thanks for introducing yourself to the listener. Just so the listener knows, this is a 6-week series planned out to be released every Sunday in Lent. We just started recording right now in February, and we'll be along the journey together, really with the listener too, as we kind of discuss what it means to be human, as you said, in the light of this technological age or era. I think let's start with the big picture. I like to say that we paint the impressionist painting in this episode because for the listener, we have talked at length about this topic and different offshoots of this topic for many years. So what we're going to synthesize is hours and hours and hours of discourse. But we want to paint this, like I said, impressionist painting of where we're going. And like I said, you'll hear our intellectual journey together. So anyway, let's paint with broad strokes because we know, like you said, there is an issue with how we relate to technology. And I think from an artist perspective, art is very prophetic. So I brought up the movie Her, but also the movie WALL-E. People think about the movie WALL-E too, where you see these people floating in space with a screen right in front of their face and like not encountering each other. Truthfully, we're not far off from that. So these films that came out, maybe 10, 15 years ago, I don't know, are prophesying in a way, like giving us a foretaste of what our future would hold. So now we're in a new space of living that. Even now, Justin, like we're not in person, we're over a screen right now, which at least we can see each other and have this conversation. But what do you think is actually happening right now? We know there's problems. What are those problems? How's it affecting us in the broad way? What are the first things that come to mind?
Yeah, that's a Great question. I'll try to tie it together best as I can. For one thing, I think a lot of the problems that I see are something that, as I mentioned, most of us are seeing to some extent. We're spending more times on screens. We hear a lot of discourse, there's articles, there's everything out there. Too much screen time is bad for us, and we get lonely, and maybe it stunts our social skills and whatnot. And all of that is very real and very true. And I wholeheartedly agree that we're facing a lot of those same problems that we're talking here. But one thing that I don't hear talked about as much, and that I think is just as important, is this idea that we've lost our connection to the real world in large part. And that's not new because of the internet. That's been going on for a long time, since the Industrial Revolution came around. But we spend less time outside. We spend less time interacting with where our food comes from, et cetera, et cetera. That's been going on for a while. And we start to interact with reality through a mediation of a screen, of an air-conditioned room, of whatever it is. And of course, there's a certain reality to it, but it's not that same encounter that you would get in going for a hike in the woods, or going for a swim, or just even sitting at home inside with a good friend and having a good, genuine conversation. When our attention is scattered everywhere, and we're not encountering real things, we start to sort of lose touch with reality in different ways. So I think that is part of the problem too. It's not just that, oh, we don't get enough exercise anymore, or we don't get enough sunlight anymore, or we don't have enough in-person interaction anymore. And all of that's very true. And I could talk about that for hours too. But I think this sense of like losing that rootedness, that connection with reality through encountering real things, through real people, we start to lose a part of what it means to live a fully flourishing human life. And so that's something that fascinates me, partly just in the abstract. I like thinking about how technology affects us. And, you kind of had brought up theology of the body before. I don't remember that initial conversation you were referring to, but it is something has occurred to me, that theology of the body also applies in a way to how we interact with not only each other, but we sort of need a theology of the body in terms of how we interact with the real world around us. We being body and soul as human beings embodied. And that's kind of key thing to remember that we're starting to lose sight of nowadays. So I think it's important, and it's interesting in and of itself, but it's also an urgent question for me in my own life. I sit in front of a desk all day, and a lot of what I see is mediated through screens. This is something I'm including myself in just as well. And so how can I live my own life in a way that doesn't turn my back on reality?
I like the phrase mediated, like there's something in between you and that connection, especially given the fact that the title of the series is rooted, like to be rooted in reality. There's no separation between the root of a tree and the ground, or the root of a plant and the ground. Like, it is in the ground. They are together. They're intertwined. They're interconnected. Versus what you're saying, or like if you need a picture in your mind, think of what the people of Wall-E look like, that they're floating on this
Just go out on the street. You'll see the same thing.
It's true. And so it is hard to have those very real encounters with people. So he brought up the Industrial Revolution, and one of the initiators of this series, at least me asking you to collaborate on this series with me, was when we did the Rerum Novarum book study, technically through the Newman Center. So thanks for running that from Louisiana. But can you give some more context of the Industrial Revolution and things that were happening 100 years ago that we're living in the effects of now?
Yeah, absolutely. So for those who don't know, Rerum Novarum was a papal encyclical that was released by the most recent Pope Leo, not the current one, Pope Leo the 13th. And this was coming at a time in the late 1800s, early 1900s kind of era, where the modern industrial age as we know it was really coming into its own, but it hadn't yet encountered the constraining measures that we put in now. So, for example, you think of children working in factories and coal mines and just really brutal, horrible conditions. And now we have laws against that in the United States, at least. But that didn't come out of nowhere. That came through this period where there were really brutal conditions. And you had, on one hand, this all out unrestrained capitalism that said everything goes down to work and subordinated the rights of the person and the rights of the family to money, essentially. And then on the other hand, you had this socialist, Marxist, communist influence as well that was saying all this is bad. We need to put everything into the state. If the family is not what's important, then we need to overthrow these structures and everything. And so the church is saying, you've all got it wrong, coming from both sides. Like we've got to come back to the dignity of the human person. And that doesn't mean an unrestrained capitalism. It means free markets. And it doesn't mean communism, although it does mean looking out for the common good. So Rerum Novarum was an attempt to kind of sift through that and present the church's social teaching to speak to that specific situation at that time because of the industrialization, the technology that had come at that time that had so radically changed the way people lived their everyday lives. It was just so different from anything that had happened before that the church felt a need to urgently address it. And they did through that. And so one of the things that fascinates me and fascinated us and inspired that study was that our current Pope Leo the 14th, was in a lot of ways inspired by that too. And I think he said this in interviews pretty explicitly, but he was inspired by this whole situation and Pope Leo the 13th in choosing his papal name. He sees, and rightly so, I would say, that we are facing a similar sort of epic changing revolution of the way that we live. Only instead of changing from the farm into the factory, we're changing from that old order into this new digital, AI thing. And so he sees an urgent need to address that in a way that does the same thing with a different technology. The first one was addressing the dignity of the human person and the family in this age of industrialization. And now he wants to do the same thing in the age of AI and digitization. Similar challenges, but the same timeless principles hold the same. It's just a matter of how do we apply that to our current situation. So that was kind of the impetus of that initial discussion we did.
So speaking of, I'm glad you brought up Pope Leo the 14th and this AI revolution that's happened. But you've also said that it's not going as quickly. I know people are concerned and should be concerned about the state of society because of AI and how especially young people are using it, those in school, people using it like their therapist. There's ads everywhere where I live with like this little pearl necklace looking thing called Friend. And it's like a little thing that you wear that listens and can see things, and you can text it. And it's, again, this AI technology trying to replace what a real friend should be through some digital algorithmic nonsense, I guess. Hopefully his first papal encyclical will be a new Rerum Novarum regarding these topics. But speaking of like 100 years ago, this is something that keeps coming up over and over again, the reflection of centuries. And I think about like the saints' relationships with technology. So like Therese just had her 100th year of her canonization last year, and she famously talked about the escalator and how this technology could like elevate you closer to God faster than taking the stairs. And then last fall, Carlo Acutis was canonized, and he's the first millennial saint, and he's also was the patron saint. He is the patron saint of the internet. So he used his gifts and his understanding of computer software or engineering, I don't know, and made websites to highlight the Eucharistic miracles. And if you read about his life, like he was really trying to help people understand the Eucharist and the real presence. And it seems like he tried different things, teaching about the Saint Tarcissus to his first communion students. And then he realized like people were really fascinated by these scientific miracles that couldn't be explained by science. And then it clicked for him like, oh, this is what my my peers are interested in, I have to tell everybody. And so he used the internet to do that. But I think, especially with all the buzz of someone like Carlo Acutis and his preciousness with his Nintendo and his Nikes, he only played games like an hour a week. And I think what's important with someone like him to highlight is that he wasn't devoid or separated from incarnational ministry or like being in the real presence of the people that he wanted to serve, his peers. And maybe he was teaching First Communion or something. Like he was totally with the people and incarnationally with the people. And a thing we've talked about, you and I, this influx of Catholic influencers where people are speaking to tens of thousands of people online. And I know for me, like the concern that I see is like, okay, but we still need the incarnational reality. Like Jesus chose 12. And from the 12, he had like 3 besties and Peter, James, and John. And Jesus was not digitally imposed into this world. He was incarnationally and really here. And so for me, like this being a Catholic podcast and a Lenten series, to me, it's really important to ponder that incarnational reality because he was here. And also we are here. And I think of Teresa of Avila, who says, like, Christ has no hands on earth but yours, has no feet on earth but yours. And that we were called to be the hands and the feet. We're called to be here and present and with people. So I guess talking about the saints and trying to learn from them, what do you think, like with the problem that we've presented about our relationship to technology and how we know it's not good, but also there are people in history like Carlo Acutis who have had tempered relationships, have had moderated relationships with technology, and he actually used it for good and for evangelization. What do you think we need to learn from these saints? And maybe it's just temperance, maybe it's something else about our relationship with technology and our relationship with one another.
Yeah, there's a lot there. A couple of different things come to mind. First, it's to acknowledge, as you said, that these are not inherently bad things. And in fact, the church has and continues to praise and encourage and even exhort us to use modern technology in a way. You mentioned Carlo Acutis' website, but even going back to, Vatican II on modern communications and different popes. I think Pope Benedict was the first pope to send a tweet or something like that. This has been something that the church has encouraged, and I do believe rightly so. So I'm not by any means saying that we need to throw this out completely. I'm not on social media. I have no desire whatsoever to do social media evangelization, but I'm glad that there are people who are doing it if we're going to have social media. And so these are things that can be used for good and should be. However, as you mentioned, it's not the only part of that equation. It's something that can draw people in, but the real work begins in person. So I'll give you an example in my own life. As I really started to own my faith and enter into a deeper conversion in high school, I just wanted to learn everything that I could about the faith. I had some things in the parish and people to talk to, but I was like, I really need to know more. So what do? You Google things, you check things, and I would come across different websites and the Catechism Online or Catholic Answers and so on, and learn all of these things online. And it was immensely formative for me. A good deal of what I learned about the faith was not necessarily through a formal catechism class, although I did learn things from that, but it was just learning things on my own that I had access to through the internet and through technology. It was a different internet then, but the same principle applies. And so there was a lot of good. Looking back on it, if I hadn't had that encounter, I'm sure God would have provided in some other way, but my life would have gone differently. It formed me in a very important way. But I didn't stop there, and I think it's important not to stop there. So, certainly we have this, and we can take these things in and do these good things. But if that doesn't translate into community with other people, time spent in acts of charity, time spent in evangelizing in person, and time spent in prayer, then something has gone very wrong. Unfortunately, there's no one-size-fits-all answer, and that's the beauty of the church. Father Mike Schmitz or someone like that is going to be very different than a Benedictine monk or a Carthusian. They're both serving the church, but in a different way with very different relationships to technology. And that's okay. But unfortunately, it means there's not necessarily a one size fits all answer. But I do think that that's the key, is to understand that it is a supplemental thing, and to understand its role as being subordinated to that in-person thing, and that as good as it can be, ultimately it's God that would be doing any work. And he doesn't need us, and he doesn't need the internet. The gospel spread long before the internet. So I think it can be easy to put so much weight and importance on ourselves, or this technology, and it's like, I have to be on this technology or I can't reach people. And certainly there's an importance there, but ultimately our own relationships and our own soul's salvation becomes key. And I would say if there's something that gets in the way of growing closer to God or of your own soul's salvation, then even if it's seemingly a good thing, it needs to be rooted out, which is what I did with social media. It was making me unhappy and anxious. And I'm sure there's a lot of good that I could do if I were still on social media, but I trust that God can use other people and other ways to do that. And I have to focus on following him in my own way.
Yeah, thank you. I love that you use the word subordinated. Like, it would be subordinate to anything you could do in person, or anything anyone could do in person, because like you said about looking on Catholic Answers and things like that, how many of us in our generation are looking online or at YouTube or listening to all of these big name Catholic speakers, and we're listening to talks all the time. But when I'm in therapy, I know that the thing that you talk about in the therapeutic session is not helpful until you go back and say, okay, here's the thing that I learned, and now I need to go practice it in life. So the therapist says, you have a stopper voice. It's a perfectionist. Okay, go out in the world and like stop listening to the stopper voice. And that takes work. And I know a lot of like book knowledge people who ask me questions like, what kind of books should I read to be better at this? And it's like, okay, yeah, intellect informs everything else, right? Informs behaviors and, self-talk and all of that. Like, intellect's key and important and foundational. But knowing it doesn't mean you're doing it. And so you only do it when you do it. And I always talk about how I got weeded out of this biology class because I could only understand it in the theoretical. And then when they would present anything in a test, I made such a low grade in that class because I couldn't take the theoretical and apply it. I could not apply these biological theories. And it was cell biology, and it was the worst. They said, this is a weed out class. And I switched my major after that class because
I didn't know
I
that.
couldn't. Yeah. Now that's why I graduated in PR instead of exercise science. But I think about that a lot because there's certain things that if given the theory, like I loved communication theory, for instance, I thought that was fascinating to take theories and apply or see it applied in life. But biology just didn't click for me. So, but in the same way, these Catholic theories or the things that we learn, whether from scripture, the catechism, some Catholic speaker, even the lives of the saints, even if we learn it intellectually, it's not the same as learning it in our own skin. Like, someone could tell you, I remember for me going to Catholic conferences for years and people saying like, you're a beloved child of God. And I remember at some point being almost annoyed by that message. Like, okay, they're really harping on this. Like, we get it. We're a beloved child of God. I remember some priest saying that he would always be preaching that and about God's love. And some parishioner or something said, Father, you're just like always preaching on that. Like, you're always saying, like, when are you going to move on to a different topic? When are you going to talk about something else? And the priest responded, like, I'll keep saying it till you believe it. And that's how I feel about certain things. Like, you can know something intellectually without understanding it in flesh and in your heart, and to the point that the way you operate, the way you live changes. That's what, to me, that's the sign. That's the sign that you understand it, is that it's lived out. The ideals that you believe in and the faith that you believe in, that you live, like you said, acts of charity, acts of service. Yeah, I'm interested in seeing how this series plays out, because I know we talked a lot about what it means to reclaim humanity. But what does that even mean? Like, I guess we're kind of presenting the problem as like parts of humanity are lost. And obviously we're not talking about everybody here. We're just talking about ourselves. This is something we're trying to reclaim our own humanity. And there's a couple things that you mentioned that are challenges for me, like the connection to our food sources. Like I've heard people talk about that and I'm like, hippy dippy stuff. Like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
So there was this Monsignor at the National Eucharistic Congress who spoke of obviously he was speaking of the Eucharist, but he talked about hunger and he talked about foods and their satiety levels. And so like how much we're satiated after eating those foods. And he's saying like broccoli is 89, a candy bar is 5, and the Eucharist is infinity. And it was a really long talk, and he talked about salvation history, literally from Adam and Eve to now, and a lot in between. He had no notes. I was like hooked on every single syllable. I've never been so engaged in a talk before because he brought in like good testimonies and obviously the scriptural reference, and it was such a fascinating topic. But he spoke specifically about like supermarkets and Piggly Wiggly, which, you know, I went to a Piggly Wiggly all the time with my granny back in the day. So he was talking about how we lost our connection to food sources, and it changed us societally. And the way he presented it just made sense to me. That was almost two years ago. And I still think about just that part of it, that we're not connected to our food sources. And sometimes comedians talk about it too. I think comedians are an interesting type of prophet because they really shed light on culture in a way. And then they're clever because they purposefully make you laugh. But there was this bit that I saw a comedian do about like how like an average person is like a medieval prince, because we're like, we want chicken wings, just wings. And it's just hilarious, again, presentation of the fact that we live in this like super hyper abundance of things, and we don't even think about the fact that that's not normal for most of human history, that we could just be like, I want chicken, but I just want the wings. That's one challenge, like for me personally, like my takeaway for today's episode, and really for one part, is that connection with food source. And so I think maybe this will be one of my Lenten penances. I want to make like a cookbook that's like seasonal to the area that I live in, and with recipes using those ingredients so that I'm eating seasonal things. I also enjoy things more seasonally. Like it's king cake season right now. And even though I can only have king cake between Epiphany and Mardi Gras, it's probably my favorite like Cajun food, or crawfish, because
It wouldn't be the same if you could have it every day.
it's not the same if you could have it every
Yeah.
day. So I've recognized this in myself, like my relationship to food, that like I really like, I love pumpkin spice latte season because I only do it in October and November. Like the rest of the year, there's no pumpkin. And obviously there's part of it that's like corporatized and like whatever, capitalism. But I do enjoy seasonal flavors and foods. And that's like, I think something that like how I want to implement a bit of what we talked about.
It's a really great point. And I think it comes back to another thing I've thought about a lot, is that as much as we've advanced in technology, we can't really get away from our human nature. And we shouldn't want to, or it's a gift. I think as a society, we kind of do want to, you know, we have transhumanism. But even if it's not as explicit as that, like you mentioned, the way that our society is set up, we've lost that sense of seasonality. You know, I mean, we have faint echoes of it in, you know, like you say, pumpkin spice lattes, things like that. And we have a deeper commemoration of it in the Catholic liturgical calendar. And in fact, in previous times, you would have things that, you know, seasonal sort of days of penance, right? Ember days and whatnot, that were really tied to the changing of the season. And all of that is speaking to that incarnational thing. But now we could be in a room and grow everything in there. And if I want strawberries or oranges in December, I can get it shipped in from wherever. And that's not completely bad. I love oranges, and if I can have one in December, I enjoy that, you know, but there is something in us that can't quite get away, just even on a physiological level, from needing that seasonality. Even daily, the work, rest, it's not just work, you know. So I think that's a really good, key, important takeaway. And leads me to another takeaway that I would add to that, is recognizing, going back to what we were talking about before, about the supplementary nature of technology. And I think recognizing a couple things. One is that it is supplemental. It should be supplemental, but it's very easy for it to become more than that, become occupy too large of a place in my time. And so recognizing, understanding what that is, but ordering it in a right way that does respect that, seasonality or the way that we're meant to interact with the world, that doesn't remove us from reality. And one of the things that came to mind as we were talking about that is this, human nature being the same. Right now, we have technology pulling us away from things, but in a way, it's not a new phenomenon. It's just that the technology is new, but before it was something else, we would just be too busy, or there's even a book that I really like a lot called The Soul of the Apostolate, and it was written around the early 1900s, kind of the same Rerum Novarum era. They didn't have the same technology, but that same temptation to do everything. Everything depends on me. I've got to use all of this media, which at the time was newspapers and youth clubs or whatever it was, and put everything into that. And they do work very hard, but they neglect prayer and they neglect contemplation and actual community. And so this was actually a monk who was put into an active apostolate out of necessity. So he was someone who was inclined to contemplation, but nevertheless, out of his duty and calling, circumstances had to do active work. And so he's like, how do we incorporate this? And, he just emphasizes a lot, all these things are great and we need them and keep doing them, but you can never say, all this depends on me. I've got to neglect my prayer life. I've got to neglect my duties and everything, because then something has gone terribly wrong. And so I think we can kind of take that and adapt that to technology, even the good things that we do with it and are good and that we can continue to do, just continuing to recall this needs to be the supplementary thing, and that this is just a doorway to encountering reality, either in conversations with other people or in getting outside, whatever that may be. And, taking some concrete step to do that. I remember, I don't think it was him, but I remember hearing there was a Catholic apologist who would train people to defend the faith and do a lot of interactions with people, talking in dialogue about different teachings and whatnot. And he told them it's very important to study these things and to do these things and get the experience, but you must pray and you must have that encounter with God. And he says, for every hour that you spend out there doing whatever mission work you're doing, you need to spend an hour in front of the Blessed Sacrament, which is like, whoa, And I think there's something to learn from that, whether it's following that exact formula or adapting it in some way. But this sense of, if we're putting everything into the concrete works of using technology, whether that's for a missionary purpose or just for our own purposes or whatever, but we're not deliberately carving out time to, above all, pray, but even just get outside, interact with people, whatever the case may be. It takes making that conscious effort. And it takes a recognition that, and a humility that we're in a different place than most people in human history, where most people would just get this in their everyday life. You go out and you work the farm or do yard work, whatever. Now it's hard work just to get to the point to where you can encounter reality. And it's not our fault, but we weren't raised with the same skills and the same way of encountering nature. And I know for myself, it's very easy to say, I want to do all the things and I want to learn all these skills that everybody else could do in previous times and all that, just recognizing I've just got to start somewhere. And maybe that's just getting outside and going for a hike one weekend, and very basic things that's embarrassingly simple, but is hard for me. But recognizing that and just doing that concrete action, like you were talking about, taking the advice from therapy or whatever, and just going out and actually doing it is key. And I wish that was more concrete, do X, Y, Z, but I think that's the important principle to keep in mind.
Yeah, there's a lot that you said there that is like simple yet profound. And I think our intention for this series is to take this conversation that's already happening. These are such buzzwords and buzz topics in a way, but bring a little nuance to this topic, and especially offer a perspective on what to do with the knowledge and what do you do next. I always try to end every episode with a little call to action, and we've kind of done that in a way. Yeah, let me see if I can synthesize all the things that you just said. Like you talked about, I think the root of what you just said right now is like to maintain a prayer life and to have that incarnational relationship with Jesus. I think particularly in the Eucharist, to spend that time with him and for everything else to be overflow, whether that be in person or digitally. And like you said, the mission kind of work is good and needed, but it has to come from a place of prayer, and there has to be that incarnational reality. Do you have any other maybe practical things that you want to say before we close?
Yeah, I think a good start is what you were talking about earlier, living in a way that enters into the season, right? And we're not just making our world conform to whatever needs I want, but recognizing that there's a constraint or something. So maybe it is just I'm going to get some food that is in season, or I'm going to pray in a certain way. We're coming up on Lent, this sacrificial time that is ultimately based around a seasonal thing. So I think finding some way to incorporate that seasonal approach is key.
I remembered something that I wanted to say too. So I was talking about food and how I'm trying to make my personal menu a little more seasonal. But I do this really well easily with fashion. And there's certain things that I wear in certain seasons. And I remember one time my roommate was complimenting an outfit of mine, and I said, "Oh, this is me transitioning into fall. Like it's a summer fall outfit because the top is summer, the skirt is fall." And she said, "Oh my gosh, you think about that?" I'm like, "Yes, I'm transitioning into my autumn wardrobe." And then like I put away things that are not for the season. I don't even look at it anymore. Like these are summer outfits, these are summer shoes. They go away until it's time. I mean, I live in Southern California, so it's basically always summer. But I think especially living in a place like where I live, where there's virtually no seasons, it's like summer and it gets a little cold at Christmas. I think Louisiana doesn't really there's more seasons than California, but
Sure.
Southern California. But people who live in a place with 4 seasons, they're always talking about like they miss living in a place with 4 seasons. So like you said too, like how it's imbued in the church calendar. I love talking about liturgical calendars because have you ever seen a liturgical calendar that kind of looks like this, where it's like a wheel and it's
Yep.
circular?
Yep.
To me, it just represents the divine so much more when it's like that, as opposed to like, an annual calendar that's like squares and whatever. Like to this, it makes more sense for me to represent the divine when it's and it's also a color wheel. So there's gradations or whatever. And that's why I love Triduum as well, because it kind of represents the transition time between Lent and Easter. I love the church calendar. I love liturgical seasons. I love that it's a round calendar and how to me it represents the divine a little bit better because it's round. And I think because we talk about the church as a bride, she's feminine, and these seasons also feels very feminine. Like if you think about especially the body and like fertility and things like that with women, these are ways of understanding our experience in humanity. Like there was a phrase said in a women's book study that I heard, "Oh, the Ecclesiastes of it all." And I felt like it was like an inside joke, or there was something there, like maybe from a previous book study that I wasn't in. When she said that phrase, the Ecclesiastes of it all, my favorite probably scripture passage in Ecclesiastes is like there's a time to die, there's a time to live, there's a time to laugh, there's a time to like rejoice, there's a time to it even says like there's a time to kill, there's a time to bring life. And it's like written into us that things are limited. That's not a bad thing. Like full access to everything all the time isn't like true freedom. And I remember Father Sibley give a talk one time on freedom, and he said, "Who's more free on a piano, like a 2-year-old who has no idea of music theory and just banging on the keys, or someone highly skilled and who understands music theory who can actually make beautiful music?" And the concept of constraint, particularly in the lens of like seasons, is what makes things beautiful, right? Because we have time constraints. Like we're only on this earth for a little while, maybe 100 years. And we have constraints seasonally, like with foods, that certain things bloom at other times, which means they are not blooming at other times. And these are things that are also very real in the spiritual, and it can inform us, and it probably can free us mentally and emotionally if we recognize that we're entering into a season of suffering before Christ's big suffering. Like it's like a smaller suffering before the big suffering. And to have that written into the church calendar in the great wisdom of the church, that to enter into this season and recognize that even though you might live in Southern California and you get 300 days of sun a year, that's not actual reality. Like there's many more gradations of seasons of experiences on earth, literally, and within the soul. And I think that's important to recognize, and that's something that's one of my takeaways, I think, from this conversation. So Justin, do you have any closing words for us?
No, I'm just really happy to be here. I'm looking forward to exploring the rest of this, like you said, not just the abstract sense of what does technology do to society, as fascinating as that is, but what does it mean to be human? And how do we live out that reality in a world that increasingly doesn't recognize that? And I'm just looking forward to do that. I think as much as there's a lot of pessimism out there about what technology is doing to us, and well-founded for a lot of reasons, I think there's also a lot of room for a lot of hope. I think that there is truly a way to live a joyful life even in this modern society. I'm still trying to figure out what it is, but I'm looking forward to exploring that with all of you.
Thank you, Justin. I appreciate you. Would you like to close us in a prayer?
Sure. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, we thank you for bringing us here today. We thank you for this time, for our conversation. We ask you to continue to guide us through these upcoming conversations, to explore the gifts that you have given us in the reality of being human as you have made us. Help us to explore that in a way that we grow closer to you and become the saints that you have called us to be. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Justin.
Thank you.
Tune in next week to hear episode 2 of Rooted. Thank you so much for tuning into this Lenten podcast series, Rooted. If you found this episode delightful, inspiring, thought-provoking, or soul-stirring, please rate and review this episode and this podcast on your listening platform. This helps other people like you learn more about the Catholic Christian view on what it means to be human and encounter the real. If you would like to receive more content like this, follow me on social media at Krista Corbello or subscribe to my mailing list at kristacorbello.com. Consider becoming a patron on Patreon to gain access to exclusive content, including sneak peeks into upcoming podcast series like Carousel Theology, as well as original music and live worship sets, voice note diaries, and my talks on the culture of life, psychology, activism, friendship, leadership, the arts, and more. All from God, all through God, and all for God. This episode is sponsored in part by TJ, Nikki, Bridget, Gina, Katrina, and JR.